Okay, so today I wanted to take a break from talking about the Fed, the Treasury, and the stock market, but I wanted to shift the gears a little bit and talk about Europe. Now, I'll jump to the conclusion first. I'm genuinely worried about Europe. Now, I'm not saying this only from economic or stock market perspective, but I'm really worried about Europe as a whole. Now, this is not only on the economy, but also on the social systems, the tax systems, the government spending system, and the industries in Europe as well. I'm worried about all of those. Now, one caveat I'll add is that I'm not too familiar with the Europe economy. I mean, I've been in Europe a few times, but I never actually lived there and don't know about what's actually going on in Europe. Now, I know that around 20% of my viewers are either in Europe or live in Europe. So for those of you who are living in Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Netherlands, Portugal, Switzerland, and any other European countries, including the UK, who may be able to provide some more context or tangible input on what I'm about to say today, please leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. I do want to learn more about what's going on in Europe and what's actually happening there. So please give us some first-person perspective on where things are headed. By the way, as I said, given I never lived in Europe, some of the things I'm saying today may not be accurate. So please correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, so where do I even start? Okay, so I'm sure a lot of you may have watched my How I Survived 6 Years in Investment Banking video. In the video, I talked in detail about how the layoff happens in investment banking and how the layoff system actually works. Now, as I said multiple times, I started working in investment banking from around 2010, and the layoff example I gave you guys in the video actually happened in 2012. Now, in 2012, the reason investment banks went through a severe layoff cycle was because of Europe. Back then, in 2012, there were 5 European countries which became a huge problem to the global economy, and those were Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. The reason those 5 countries became economically vulnerable was because of a simple reason: debt. Now, after the euro currency was launched in 1999 and physical notes and coins being introduced in 2002, countries with smaller economies within the Eurozone, such as Greece and Portugal, were assumed to have a safe credit as much as the German Bund, i.e. the German government bonds. Now, this made the borrowing a lot cheaper for the smaller economies in the Eurozone, so the government started issuing a lot of bond, i.e. borrowing a lot of money at cheap rates. Now, as I say about leverage all the time, when the economy is doing fine, more leverage generally works. However, with the 2008 global financial crisis, the high leverage destroyed the smaller economies within the Eurozone. Spain and Ireland went through massive real estate bubble prior to 2008, and when the real estate bubble popped, millions lost jobs. Ireland's government even guaranteed the bank's liabilities post-2008, which backfired with the private banking crisis turning into a sovereign crisis down the road. Now, on Greece was even misreporting their fiscal debt level to meet the euro entry rules. Their debt to GDP was actually at around 120 to 125%, but they misreported it to around 100% to meet the euro entry regulation. Greece's industry was also severely skewed towards the public sector, accounting for around 30% of total employment. Now, as I said, when the government can borrow money at a cheap rate, this may be sustainable. But if there's a credit crunch, the government can't borrow money infinitely to pay these workers. They were also paying generous pensions and early retirement schemes to people, which led to an even higher deficit. Now, when you have 30% of the employees in the country working for the country, there is not enough real economies where taxes can be collected. This basically led to a structural weakness, which led to lower productivity and higher deficits. Italy and Portugal were no different. Both countries had chronic low productivity with high debt, with government-driven spending and political instability, which led to a huge crisis. Now, to give you some context, shortly after the financial crisis, Greece had debt to GDP of around 127%, which eventually rose to almost 200%. Italy was at around 120%, and Portugal was at around 100%. Ireland was at around 60 to 70%, but eventually rose to 120%. And Spain was at around 60 to 70%, which eventually rose to around 100%. Now, when the crisis happened, each of the countries either directly or indirectly received rescue package from the European Central Bank, aka the ECB. Greece received 110 billion euros in 2010 and got another 130 billion euros in 2012. Ireland got 85 billion euros in 2010. Portugal got 78 billion euros in 2011. Italy and Spain did not get direct bailouts, but were intervened by the ECB through the Outright Monetary Transactions Program, which is effectively a QE by the ECB on those nations to lower the spiking bond yield. Okay, so that was a bit of background to help you understand the European crisis which happened from 2008 to 2012. The lesson here is this. If you have a less productive and slow-growing economy with high government borrowings, things can go really wrong. Now, after the intervention of the ECB, things stabilized in those countries. Portugal's unemployment decreased from around 18% in 2013 to around 5 to 6%, and its debt to GDP is stable. Italy's unemployment decreased from 12% to 7 to 8%, though its debt to GDP is still very high at over 130%. Ireland's unemployment decreased from 15% to around 4 to 5%, while its debt to GDP is only at around 40 to 45%. Greece's unemployment decreased from 27 to 28% to around 10%, and its debt to GDP decreased from almost 200% to around 150% level. Spain's unemployment decreased from around 26% to around 10%. Its debt to GDP is at around 100%. Now, as you can see, things are still bad. Unemployment rate and debt to GDP of most of those countries are still very high, but the good news is that they're improving, though they're still vulnerable. Okay, now, having said that, the reason I'm making this video is because of the recent events that are taking place around France. As many of you may have seen from the news, France is going through an economic trouble, which, from my perspective, is really hard to be resolved at the moment. Now, any country can run into economic troubles, but the reason this is quite worrisome is because France is the second largest economy in the EU after Germany. Now, what this basically means is that the level of debt and the economic system which France carries in this huge continent is much larger in scale than any other country which were previously in trouble. I mean, Italy and Spain were large economies too, right behind France, but France's economy had a symbolic nature on its own. Generally, if a large economy faces trouble, it ripples down to the smaller economies, and this is why the 2008 financial crisis was such a huge blow to the entire world, given it originated from the US. Now, this is the reason why larger economies need to stand strong in order to avoid experiencing any contagious risks. Okay, now, enough of the useless talk, and let's look at some key numbers for France. Debt to GDP is at around 115% and expected to go up to 120% by 2027. GDP growth is very low at around 1%, but expected to go much lower in 2025. Unemployment is very high at around 7.5 to 8%. Consumer confidence is at around high 80s to low 90s, which is much lower than the long-term average of 100. Fiscal deficit amount is at around 160 billion euros. Fiscal deficit as percentage of GDP is at around 5.5 to 6%. Now, one thing to note here is that EU's deficit limit is 3%. So France's deficit is already almost double of the limit which is suggested by the EU. Okay, so these are the numbers. Okay, so to interpret the numbers, what's going on is that France's GDP growth is extremely low, which means less tax collection, and unemployment rate is really high, which means less tax collection and more unemployment welfare. While national debt is already really high, which means limited room to fund the deficit with more debt, while fiscal deficit is also extremely high, which means that despite having limited room for more debt, they need to borrow more debt. Now, fundamentally, in order for an economy to survive, either GDP growth needs to be high, or unemployment needs to be low, or debt level needs to be low, or fiscal account needs to be recording a surplus. However, France is recording the opposite for all those metrics. Now, the real problem here is that France is issuing bonds to fund the deficits. However, their annual bond issuance is around 420 to 460 billion euros a year, and around 300 billion of that is used to pay back the mature bond, and the remaining 120 to 160 billion euros is entirely used to pay their deficit. This basically means that their entire new borrowing is used for refinancing and deficit management. Okay, well, up to this point, you might think, so what? The US has a lot of debt, and they also have deficits, but they're fine. The key difference between the US and France, and potentially the entire Eurozone, is that the US has the dollar, which is the reserve currency of the world, while Euro, while being a very powerful currency, is not really a reserve currency of the world. Therefore, infinitely issuing bonds of the euro currency will directly impact the credit healthiness of the country, as well as the position of the currency in the international market, which may lead to a chaotic situation for the entire regional economy. Now, apart from this point, the other more important reason this is becoming a problem today is because France's bond yield, which is the yield of the country's government bond, is rising sharply. Now, generally, to assess whether the Eurozone countries are economically doing well, one metric which we look at is the yield spread against the German Bund, which is the German government bond. Given Germany is the central country of the entire Eurozone with the largest economy, how much spread a country's bond yield has against the German Bund is a way to assess a Eurozone country's economic condition. Now, as many of you know, yield is basically the effective interest you pay on a bond. For example, if there's a $100 bond and the yield is 3%, you would get 3% interest per annum. However, while you're holding that bond, if the price of the bond goes up to $110 because of the demand for the bond goes up significantly, your yield will be 3% divided by $110, which is around 2.7%. Now, if the bond price goes down to $90 because people are selling the same bond in the market, the yield would be $3 divided by $90, which is around 3.3%. So the yield fluctuates depending on the demand of the bond. If the yield is high, a country would need to benchmark that high yield for their future bond issuance, so they would need to pay more interest on the bond and vice versa. Now, historically, given France is a smaller economy than Germany, their bond has a higher yield, i.e. a higher interest paid on the bond. The spread of the yield, which is basically the gap between the French bond and the German Bund, was around 30 to 50 basis points up until 2021, which means that France had to pay around 30 to 50 basis point more interest than Germany. But today, it's gone up to almost 80 and as high as 85 basis point in 2024. Now guys, for those of you who may not understand what this gap means, for a sovereign bond, every basis point matters. Given the size of the public debt which a country has and a country issues is huge in size, every basis point increase in the interest is a critical hit on their fiscal condition. Now, a 80 to 85 basis point yield gap compared to the nearest country, which uses the same currency, this is catastrophic for France. Also, as a side note, on top of all this happening, NATO and the US are continuously pressuring France and other European allies to boost defense spending, which is an additional fiscal pressure for these countries as well. Now, under a situation like this, a country generally has a couple of options. It can either raise taxes, cut government spending, or borrow more. But as I said, France has a low GDP growth with high unemployment, which makes it hard for them to raise the taxes. Also, cutting government spending seems challenging, as well as their welfare spending, which takes up around 60% of their total public spending and over 30% of GDP, is hard to be cut down due to political issues. Also, borrowing more is not feasible given it will increase the supply of French bond in the market, which will further increase the yield on the French bonds, which will be catastrophic for France. Okay, now, I said a lot of things so far, but France aside, I'm also worried about the impact it may bring to other Eurozone countries, as well as even non-Eurozone countries like the UK. Now, if France has into real trouble involving a potential default, the 1 to 1.5 trillion euros of sovereign debt, which the French banks hold, may incur huge losses, which may incur an extreme credit crunch event in France, which may lead to a contagion risk, spreading to other Eurozone countries like Germany, Belgium, Italy, and Spain. Also, the confidence on the euro itself may plummet, which may incur a huge depreciation of the euro, which may also lead to a hyperinflation in the euro area. Also, non-euro countries like the UK may also be impacted, as French banks have a huge exposure to the UK through London's financial markets, which could impact the UK's equity markets. Also, given the UK and France are very tight trading partners, this could trigger a slowdown in the economy of the UK as well. Just as a side note, As another key country in Europe, UK's economy is very bad as well, which is very worrisome. From my perspective, it's not much better than France's. Instead, the GDP is at 100%, deficit is at 4 to 5% of its GDP, and bond yield is at mid 4%, which is even higher than Germany and France's. Inflation is also high, and GDP growth is extremely low at sub 1%. Given it's not part of the Eurozone, it's surviving through quantitative easing provided by the Bank of England. But these kind of negative events taking place in neighboring countries is not good at all for the UK as well. Okay, so we'll have to see what happens in the near term, but whatever happens, I do believe there needs to be some structural reformations taking place for France as well. When the other countries like Portugal, Ireland, and Greece accepted the bailout packages from the ECB, they also went through a lot of restructuring such as fiscal consolidation, labor market reforms, banking sector capitalization, pension reforms, and etc. Now, I don't know whether France will end up taking in a ECB package, but I do think France and ECB will make a good judgment, whatever the situation is. Despite the challenging conditions under the leadership of Christine Lagarde, I believe ECB has been doing a very good job in maintaining the balance among countries while providing liquidity backstops using financial stability tools in the past. So I believe they'll come up with some kind of solution to the situation. Now guys, having that said, as I said earlier on, I'm only speaking from an outsider's perspective, so there's limitation on what I can say. And also, I believe the situation is a lot more complicated than how much I can understand. Also, it's really difficult to comprehend what kind of feelings each nation and people of each nation involved in the situation are going through. Now again, as an outsider, I do hope to understand the situation better, and how you guys think about this issue. So for those of my viewers in Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Netherlands, Switzerland, and other European countries, including the UK, please let us know how you think. After all I can do about this issue is to explain the data, but I can't explain what's actually going on. I hope to hear what you guys think. Thank you, and I'll be back with more videos very soon.